The gavel had not yet fallen when Ellen Crawford raised her hand, and the laughter that followed was the kind that burrowed under the skin and stayed there long after the sound itself had died. It was the autumn of 1883, in the sun-scorched town of Caldwell, Kansas, where the cattle drive still churned the main street into a river of dust and dung, and where a woman's ambition was considered either charming or dangerous, depending entirely on who she was speaking to. Ellen Crawford was 26 years old, and she had ridden 11 miles on a borrowed roan mare to attend the Caldwell land auction, the kind of event that drew ranchers and speculators and red-faced men with thick wallets and louder opinions. She wore her late father's coat, the cuffs slightly too long, the shoulders slightly too broad, and she had sewn the tear in the left breast pocket herself the night before. Her dark hair was pulled back firmly beneath a battered hat, and her boots were clean despite the ride, because she had thought to wrap them before she set out. The parcel of land on the block was 43 acres along the eastern fork of Bluff Creek, with good grass and a freshwater spring, and a two-room cabin that sat on a rise, so that in the mornings the light came through the eastern window and turned everything gold. Ellen knew this because it had been her father's land. Samuel Crawford had died the previous February from a fever that came on fast and left nothing behind, and the bank in Wichita had called in his debts before the ground above him had even settled proper. The land had gone to auction with everything else, and Ellen had spent 6 months working as a seamstress and taking in washing and doing every honest thing she could think of to scrape together the money to buy it back. She had $230 in a cloth pouch tucked into the inside of her coat. It was almost everything she had left in the world. When the auctioneer, a portly man named Bixby with a spectacular auburn mustache, called the Crawford parcel to the block, a ripple of awareness passed through the crowd. There were perhaps 40 men gathered in the wide yard behind the courthouse, all of them with hats pushed back and thumbs in their belts, and several of them knew very well whose land this had been, and knew very well the woman who stood among them now. One of them, a man named Gerald Pratt, who ran the largest cattle operation in the county and who had been eyeing the Crawford land for 2 years, turned slightly toward his associates and muttered something, and 2 of them chuckled. Bixby began his call at $150. Gerald Pratt raised his hand immediately. 150. Ellen waited. She had told herself to wait, to be measured, to not rush. Bixby called for 175. Another man in the crowd, a land speculator from Wichita named Holloway, whom she did not recognize, raised 2 fingers. 175. Ellen's hand went up. 200. The silence lasted perhaps 2 full seconds before it dissolved into laughter. Not everyone laughed, but enough did, and the ones who did made no effort to conceal it. Someone near the back made a remark she could not quite hear, though she caught the word petticoat. Gerald Pratt smiled the way men smile when they are performing certainty for an audience. Even Bixby looked momentarily uncertain, glancing around the crowd as though checking whether he was permitted to take her bid seriously. Ellen kept her hand raised and her chin level and her expression entirely composed, though the heat that climbed her neck had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. It was then that she became aware of the single exception. He was standing toward the outer edge of the crowd, slightly apart from the men around him, and he was not laughing. He was not smiling. He was watching her with an expression that was difficult to name, something that sat between recognition and respect, and his arms were crossed at his chest in a way that looked like stillness rather than disinterest. He was tall, with the lean, weathered build of a man who had spent years doing genuine outdoor work, and he wore a plain dark coat over a collarless shirt, and a hat that had seen considerable use. He was perhaps 30 years old, perhaps a little older, with a strong jaw and dark eyes that were fixed entirely and without apology on Ellen Crawford's raised hand. She noticed him for exactly 3 seconds before she dragged her attention back to Bixby, who had recovered himself and was calling the bid acknowledged. Gerald Pratt went to $225. Ellen, without hesitation, said $230. The crowd shifted. Pratt's expression changed. He was not a man who enjoyed being challenged, especially not in public, and especially not by a woman in an oversized coat with mud on the hem of her skirt. He pushed his bid to $250. Ellen's heart sank straight to the bottom of her chest. She had nothing left. She stood very still, and the wind came across the yard and pushed a curl of dust across her boots, and Bixby was calling for $250, asking if anyone would meet $250, and the gavel was rising. The tall man at the edge of the crowd uncrossed his arms. He did not shout. He said it at a moderate, clear volume, the way a man says something he means. $275. The crowd turned. Pratt turned. Bixby turned. Ellen turned. The tall man met Pratt's glare with perfect equanimity, and then looked back at Bixby, who, after a moment of processing what had just happened, called out for anyone to match $275. Gerald Pratt stared at the stranger for a long moment. Then he looked at the land description in his hand. Then he made a sound through his nose that was something between contempt and calculation, and he stepped back and the gavel fell. $275. Sold. Ellen did not move immediately. She stood in the yard while the crowd broke apart around her, some of the men still talking and laughing about something else now. And she looked at the man who had just bought her father's land, and she did not know whether to thank him or be furious with him or both. And the honest answer was that it was both, running together like the two forks of Bluff Creek after a heavy rain. He made his way toward her without hurry, moving through the dispersing crowd with the kind of ease that came from being comfortable in your own body, and he stopped a few feet away and took his hat off and held it at his side, which struck her as a gesture so automatically respectful that it disarmed her somewhat against her will. "Marshal Collier," he said, "I understand that land belonged to your family." Ellen looked at him directly. "It did. My father built that cabin. I came here today to buy it back." She paused. "You spent $275 that I cannot repay you." "I didn't buy it to sell it back to you," he said. "I haven't decided yet what I intended. I only knew I wasn't going to let Pratt take it at a laughing woman's expense." The bluntness of it surprised her into silence for a moment. She had expected apology or negotiation or some form of the particular condescension she had grown accustomed to receiving from men who thought they were being kind. "You could have let me fight my own battles," she said. "I watched you fight it," he said. "You fought it well. You were outspent, not outfought. There's a difference." She looked at him for a long moment. The sun was falling behind the courthouse, and the shadow of the building reached across the yard like a long, dark arm. Around them, the last of the crowd was drifting toward the street. Bixby was folding up his papers. "What do you want for it?" she asked. He turned his hat once in his hands. "Nothing today," he said. "I expect we ought to talk like two reasonable people before we decide anything. Are you staying in town tonight, Miss Crawford?" "I have no money for a room," she said, because she saw no advantage in pretending otherwise. He nodded as though this were a piece of information that required consideration rather than pity. "There's a boarding house on Depot Street. Mrs. Hanratty. Tell her I sent you and I'll settle it in the morning." Ellen Crawford had not survived 6 months of hard independence by accepting charity gracefully, and the objection was already forming in her throat, but something about the straightforward way he said it, without performance or expectation, caused her to simply nod once. "I'll pay you back for the room," she said. "I know you will," he said, and settled his hat back on his head. "Good evening, Miss Crawford." He walked away, and she watched him go, and she thought about the fact that he had been the only one in that entire crowd who had not laughed, and she thought about this for a long time standing in the empty yard, while the wind picked up the last of the day's dust and carried it away east. Mrs. Hanratty's boarding house was run by a small, efficient woman of perhaps 55 who had the bearing of a person who had seen a great deal and had arrived at a settled opinion of most of it. She showed Ellen to a room on the second floor that had a wash basin and a window that faced the street, and told her that supper was at 7 and that she ran a quiet house and expected it to remain that way. Ellen washed her face and hands and sat on the edge of the narrow bed and allowed herself, in private, to feel the full weight of the afternoon. The land had sold. Not to Pratt, which was something. But it was not hers. It belonged to a stranger who had stepped into the auction like a stone dropped in still water and changed the surface of everything. She did not know what to make of Marshall Collier. She did not know whether his interference had been a kindness or a complication or something else entirely, and she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge that the uncertainty was not entirely unwelcome, which was itself a disturbing thing to notice. She came down to supper and found the table occupied by 3 other boarders, 2 traveling salesmen and an elderly schoolteacher named Mr. Farrow who was passing through on his way to Dodge City. Marshall Collier was not among them, which was both a relief and, she admitted privately, a small disappointment. She ate Mrs. Hanratty's beef stew and fresh bread and drank 2 cups of black coffee, and she answered Mr. Farrow's questions about herself with measured courtesy. And when she went back upstairs, she sat by the window and watched the street below where the saloons were beginning their nightly noise, and she thought about what she would say to Marshall Collier in the morning. He came at 9 o'clock, while she was in the small parlor Mrs. Hanratty reserved for the use of boarders. He knocked at the front door, and Mrs. Hanratty showed him in and then discreetly disappeared, which suggested to Ellen that she had a slightly higher opinion of Marshall Collier than of strangers in general. He was carrying his hat again, which she was already beginning to recognize as a habit. He sat in the chair across from her when she gestured to it, and he had the quality of a man who did not fill silence with noise, which she appreciated. "I spoke with Bixby this morning," he said. "The deed is recorded in my name. That's the legal reality." "I understand that," she said. "I also spoke with the bank in Wichita," he said. "The debt your father owed was $412. The sale price was applied, which leaves a remainder. I paid that." Ellen was very still. "Why would you do that?" He looked at the window for a moment, then back at her. "Because it was the straightforward thing to do. The land should be yours. Your father built it. You tried to recover it. The only reason you couldn't is that you ran out of money at 2:30, which had nothing to do with your intentions." "Mr. Collier," she said carefully, "I do not know you. We have exchanged perhaps 20 words. You have spent a considerable sum of money on my account, and I want to understand what it is you expect in return." He looked at her with what she could only describe as appreciation for the directness of the question. "Nothing that isn't freely given," he said. "I came to Caldwell because I'm looking for land. I've been trail driving for 8 years, and I want to stop. I had money saved, and I was ready to buy something and build something, and when I saw that parcel go up and saw what was happening, I made a decision. I'm not asking you to thank me. I'm asking whether we can work something out that's fair to both of us." "What kind of something?" she said. "A partnership," he said. "I know cattle, you know that land. The 43 acres are good grazing, there's water, and there's a cabin that needs some work but is structurally sound. I can put in the labor and some additional capital, and you can run the household side of things, and we split what the operation yields. The deed can be held jointly." Ellen studied him. "A partnership," she repeated. "Yes," he said. "That is an unusual arrangement," she said. "You are an unusual woman," he said simply, without flattery, as though he were stating that the sky was blue or that the creek ran north. Something warm shifted in her chest, and she refused to examine it too closely. "I would need to see it written," she said. "A proper agreement, signed and witnessed." "Of course," he said. "And I would need to understand that I am an equal party in all decisions regarding the land and the operation." "That is what equal means," he said. She looked at him for another long moment. Outside, a wagon rolled past on the street, and someone called out a greeting to someone else, and the ordinary sounds of the morning went on without concern for the unusual thing that was being decided in Mrs. Hanratty's parlor. "All right," Ellen said. "Let's ride out and look at it together." The road out to the Crawford land was familiar under Ellen's hands, even on the borrowed roan, and she rode it with the particular ease of someone who has made a trip enough times that the body remembers it independently of the mind. Marshall rode beside her on a big bay gelding that moved well, and they did not speak very much for the first several miles, which was not uncomfortable. The autumn grass on either side of the road was the color of tarnished copper, and the sky above it was the hard, brilliant blue that only Kansas produced in October, and the light was thin and clear and showed everything without mercy. "How long have you been driving cattle?" asked when they crossed the creek bridge 2 miles out. "Since I was 19, he said. "Started at the bottom, as most do, made it to trail boss on my last 2 drives up from Texas." "Where are you from originally?" "Missouri," he said. "St. Joseph, my mother still lives there." He paused. "My father died when I was 14. She glanced at him. "I lost my father this past February." "I know," he said. "I'm sorry." "How do you know?" "Bixby told me some of it yesterday before the auction. And I asked around a little this morning." He said it without self-consciousness. "I like to know what I'm walking into." "And what did you find out?" she said, not unkindly. "That Samuel Crawford was well regarded by most of the town. That his debts came from a bad winter 3 years ago that hit his cattle hard. That his daughter has been working to reclaim the property since spring. That she is respected for her competence and found remarkable for her stubbornness, depending on who you ask." He said the last part with a slight curve at the corner of his mouth. "And which did you conclude?" she asked. "I concluded that stubbornness and competence are frequently the same quality wearing different hats," he said. Ellen laughed before she could stop it, a short, genuine sound that surprised her. She turned back to the road ahead and composed herself, but she was aware that he had seen it, and she was aware that she did not entirely mind. The cabin sat on its rise exactly as she remembered it, and the sight of it did something to her chest that she could not have articulated. The chinking between some of the logs had worked loose over the winter and spring, and the roof of the small lean-to addition her father had built had partially collapsed, and the kitchen garden was entirely overtaken by weeds. But the main structure was solid, and the spring ran clear and cold when she knelt beside it, and the grass on the lower pasture was good. Marshall walked the property with a careful, measuring eye, and he did not speak for a long time, just moved through the space taking it in, crouching occasionally to look at the soil or the grass or the state of the fencing. She watched him from the rise and tried to decide what she thought of him, and found that what she thought was more complicated and more interesting than a simple verdict. He came back up to where she stood and looked at the cabin. "The lean-to needs to come down and be rebuilt proper," he said. "The main cabin just needs work. Roof is solid. I can have the chinking done inside a week. The kitchen garden can be cleared and planted again in spring. The fencing along the east pasture is in poor condition and will need to be replaced before we can hold cattle there." "And the creek access," she said. "Clear," he said. "Good drinking water for stock. The spring is better. I'd rather not depend on creek water for the household." She nodded slowly. She was looking at the cabin and thinking about her father moving through it, about the smell of his pipe on winter evenings and the sound of him at his desk after supper, scratching at his account books. She pressed her lips together. "He built this himself," she said quietly, "with 2 hired men. It took the summer of 1864. Marshall said nothing immediately. Then he said, "It's a good build." He knew what he was doing. "He always did," she said. They stood together in the silence of the place, and the wind moved through the grass below them, and somewhere along the creek a hawk cried out once. The agreement was drawn up by a lawyer in Caldwell named Whitmore, who had the slightly dazed look of a man who had been asked to do something that fell outside his ordinary experience but was determined to do it properly. He wrote a partnership agreement that specified joint ownership of the property, equal standing in decisions related to land and livestock management, and a division of profits from cattle operations to be revisited annually. Ellen read every word of it twice before she signed it, and Marshall watched her do so without impatience. "You read contracts thoroughly," he said afterward, as they stood on the plank sidewalk outside Whitmore's office. "My father taught me that you should understand what you're agreeing to," she said. "He said a man who signs a document he hasn't read is a man who trusts the world more than it deserves." "He sounds like someone worth knowing," Marshall said. "He was," Ellen said. She looked down the street at the busy afternoon of Caldwell going about its business. "He was the best person I have ever known." There was a weight in how she said it that he received without deflecting, and she appreciated that he did not immediately offer something lighter or more comfortable in its place. They rode back to the property that afternoon and began the work of it. The first weeks were the most peculiar of Ellen Crawford's adult life. The cabin had 2 rooms, and the arrangement was that Marshall would sleep in the smaller room, which had served as her father's study, while Ellen took the main bedroom. It was a practical solution to a practical problem, and it was the arrangement of 2 people who were partners and nothing else, and they were both entirely clear on this, and they were also both entirely aware of the specific quality of the silence that sometimes fell between them in the evenings when the work was done, and they sat by the fire and the wind moved around the eaves of the cabin. Marshall Collier was a man of remarkable usefulness. He could repair almost anything. He had the kind of relationship with tools and materials that looked effortless, but was clearly the result of years of application, and he worked with a steady, unhurried competence that Ellen found deeply satisfying to observe. He rechinked the cabin walls in 5 days. He took down the collapsed lean-to and began the frame of a new one that was properly sized and correctly roofed. He repaired the east fence line over the course of 3 days, digging post holes in the hard October ground with a thoroughness that left her arms tired just from watching, and he helped her without being asked, which was something she had to adjust to. When she was clearing the kitchen garden, he appeared beside her with a spade and worked the outer rows without comment. When she was hauling water from the spring, he took 2 of the buckets without negotiation. It was not performed helpfulness, the kind meant to be noticed and appreciated. It was simply a recognition that there was work to be done and 2 people to do it. She found, gradually, that she trusted him. This was not a small thing. Ellen Crawford had learned to be careful with trust because the world had educated her in its cost, and she had become accustomed to standing inside her own competence like a fortress, which kept her safe and also sometimes very alone. He told her things about himself in pieces, the way a man reveals himself who is neither performing modesty nor performing openness, but is simply answering honestly when asked. He told her about the drives he had been on, about the enormous, terrible beauty of driving 3,000 cattle across the Red River in flood, about the particular silence of the Llano Estacado at night, about men he had ridden with whom he had liked and a few he had not. He told her about his mother in St. Joseph, a small, determined woman named Clara who ran a dry goods store and wrote him letters once a month with the meticulous regularity of a person who believes that correspondence is a form of love. "You should write to her," Ellen said one evening. They were at the table after supper, Ellen mending a shirt of her father's that she had kept, Marshall reading a newspaper that had come through on the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe 3 days prior. He looked up. "I do write to her." "I mean you should tell her where you are," she said. "What you've done, she likely worries." He considered this. "She does," he said. "She thinks the frontier is more dangerous than it is." "It is fairly dangerous," Ellen pointed out. "Compared to what she imagines, it's positively serene," he said, and there was a warmth in his voice when he spoke about his mother that Ellen filed away in the place where she kept things she wanted to remember. In November, Marshall bought 6 cattle from a rancher named Dempsey who ran stock north of town, good quality heifers that he said would winter well, and give them a foundation herd to build from in spring. He paid for them from his savings and noted it in their joint account book with the same seriousness he brought to everything, and Ellen matched his seriousness in reviewing the figures, and they sat at the table together in the lamplight going over the numbers, and once their hands nearly touched reaching for the same page, and they both moved back and looked at different parts of the room for a moment. In December, the first snow came. It arrived on a Tuesday, quietly and without drama, and by morning the whole world outside the cabin window was uniform and white, and the sky was the color of undyed wool. Ellen woke before Marshall and built up the fire and put water on for coffee, and when he came out of his room, hair dark and disordered from sleep, moving in the particular cautious way of someone not yet fully awake, she handed him a cup without comment, and he took it and looked at the snow through the window and said, "Well," and she said, "Yes," and that was the whole of the conversation about it, and somehow it contained everything necessary. Gerald Pratt came out in the first week of December. Ellen saw him coming from a quarter-mile away, his horse throwing up small clouds of snow with each step, and she knew before he arrived that his expression was not going to be pleasant. She went to the door of the cabin and stood in it, and Marshall came from the lean-to where he had been working, and they stood together in front of the cabin when Pratt pulled up. Pratt was a broad man with a red face that tended toward the florid, and he had the bearing of someone accustomed to being large in every room and open space he occupied. He looked at Ellen and then at Marshall with equal disdain, and then at the property around him with the possessive eye of a man who still considered it improperly distributed. "Collier," he said, "didn't realize you were setting up housekeeping out here." "Good morning, Mr. Pratt," Marshall said. "I'd like to make you an offer on this land," Pratt said. He did not look at Ellen when he said it. $300 clear, you paid $275 plus the debt so you'd come out ahead. "The land is held jointly," Marshall said. "You'd need to speak to both parties." Pratt's gaze moved to Ellen with visible reluctance. "Miss Crawford," he said as though the words cost him something, $300, you could set yourself up somewhere more suitable. "More suitable for what?" she said. Pratt smiled the particular smile of a man who believes he is being very patient. "For a woman on her own," he said. "This is a cattle operation. Winter is hard out here." "I think you'd be more comfortable, Mr. Pratt," Ellen said. "This is my father's land which I am recovering and building into a going concern with my partner. It is not for sale. Not today and not at any price that is less than the full worth of what we intend to build here. Thank you for the ride out." Pratt stared at her. Then he looked at Marshall. Marshall looked back at him with his arms at his sides and his expression entirely neutral, in a way that communicated considerably more than a threatening posture would have. Pratt pulled his horse around. "I'll come back with a better offer," he said. "We'll be here," Ellen said. He rode away and they watched him go, and when he was far enough out across the snow-covered pasture, Ellen let out a long, slow breath and turned to find Marshall watching her with an expression that she had begun to recognize, the one that was somewhere between admiration and something deeper that he had not yet given a name to, or if he had kept it internal. "Suitable," she said flatly. "He's going to keep coming," Marshall said. "He wants this water access. It's about the spring." "I know what it's about," she said. "Let him keep coming. The answer will be the same." Winter moved through December into January with the methodical indifference of the Kansas plains. The temperatures dropped to places that made the mornings an exercise in determination, and the cattle had to be checked, and the water in the troughs had to be kept from freezing, and there were days when the wind came from the north with a cutting edge that drove through even the heaviest wool coat. But the cabin was warm, properly rechinked, and well stocked with wood that Marshall had cut in November, and the evenings by the fire had a quality that Ellen was aware she had come to depend on. They talked about everything. This was what surprised her most, more than his competence, more than his decency, more than the way he moved through the world with such quiet assurance. He wanted to know what she thought about things. He wanted to know her opinion on the cattle market, on the way the town of Caldwell was changing as the drives began to shift west, on the question of whether the government policies toward the Plains tribes were producing justice or its opposite. He listened when she answered. He considered what she said. He sometimes disagreed with her, and when he did he said so directly and with reasons, and he did not retract his disagreement merely because she pushed back, but he also changed his mind when she made a point he had not considered, and she found that the combination was deeply, unexpectedly satisfying. My father used to say that the Cheyenne were not going anywhere, she said one January evening. They were talking about the newspapers, which were full of the ongoing displacement of the Plains peoples onto reservations. He said that a people's connection to their land was not something any government could simply legislate away and expect no consequence. He was right about the consequence, Marshall said. The policy has been brutal and short-sighted from the beginning. Forcing people off land they've lived on for generations doesn't make the grievance disappear. It buries it. She looked at him. Not everyone in this part of the country would say that. I'm aware, he said. I've ridden with men who hold the opposite view enthusiastically. I've argued the point before. It doesn't always go well. And yet you keep arguing it. He looked at the fire for a moment. My mother raised me to believe that comfort is not a good reason to ignore what's true. Ellen was quiet for a moment. She sounds like a good woman, she said. She is, he said. You'd like her. He said it simply, and then seemed to become aware that he had said it, and he looked back at the fire and turned the coffee cup in his hands. The air between them had been changing for weeks with the slow inevitability of weather, building without announcing itself, and Ellen was not unaware of it, and she suspected he was not either. She was simply not certain what to do with it yet, and she thought he was waiting, in the way he did everything, with patience and without pressure. It was in late January that everything shifted. She had gone out in the early morning to check on the cattle before breakfast, and she had not taken her heaviest coat because she had thought the errand would be brief, and the temperature had dropped during the night to a degree that was serious. She was coming back from the east pasture, her breath clouding in front of her, when she put her foot through a thin crust of ice over a depression in the ground and went down hard, and she heard rather than felt the sharp crack in her left ankle as she fell. She did not cry out. She lay in the snow for a moment taking stock, and then she tried to stand, and her ankle informed her immediately that this was a bad idea, and she sat back down and thought about the situation. The cabin was 200 yards away. The snow was ankle-deep. She could crawl, which was undignified and slow, or she could call out and hope that he heard her, or she could wait and trust that, when she didn't appear for breakfast, he would come looking. She was attempting the crawl option, which was both undignified and slow as promised, when she heard his footsteps in the snow and looked up to find him coming toward her with an expression that contained, in equal parts, alarm and the effort to keep the alarm from making her feel worse. Your ankle, he said, reading it immediately from the angle of her foot. I went through the ice over a hollow, she said. I don't think it's broken. I think it's a bad sprain. He crouched beside her and looked at it with careful hands, and she felt the professional competence in his touch even through the cold and the pain, and he said, I need to get you inside. And then without any further discussion he lifted her, and she made a sound of protest, and he said, Ellen. And it was the first time he had used her name without the miss, and the way he said it stopped her protest entirely. He carried her across the snow-covered pasture and through the cabin door, and set her down in the chair nearest the fire with a gentleness that was somewhat at odds with the size of him, and he pulled off her boot with careful hands and examined the ankle, which was already swelling, and declared it a bad sprain but not broken, and he wrapped it with strips of cloth and elevated it on the footstool and brought her coffee, and then went back out to finish checking the cattle without being asked. She sat by the fire with her ankle elevated and her coffee in her hands and felt something she had not felt in a very long time, which was looked after, not managed, not condescended to, not pitied. Simply tended to by someone who understood the distinction between helping a person and diminishing them. When he came back in, she said, Thank you. He hung up his coat and turned to look at her. You're welcome. I mean for all of it, she said. Not just this morning, for the auction, for the agreement, for how you've been these past months. He was quiet for a moment. He came and sat in the chair across from her, and the fire was between them, and the winter light came through the window and lay across the floor of the cabin. Ellen, he said, and there was something different in his voice now. I should tell you something that I have been thinking about for some time. She waited. "When I came to that auction, I didn't come with any intention beyond looking for land," he said. "And then I saw you raise your hand and I saw what happened and I bid because it was the right thing to do. That part I feel clear about." He paused. "But I have stayed and I have worked, and I have been honest about that being because I wanted to build something here. And that is also true. But I want to be straightforward with you because I think you deserve that." He looked at her steadily. "I have come to care for you a great deal, and I think you should know that so that you can decide what you want to do about it." The fire crackled. Outside, the wind moved across the eaves. Ellen Crawford looked at Marshal Collier across the cabin floor and thought about the past months, about the way he had stood beside her when Pratt came riding up, about the way he listened when she talked, about the way he had said her name when she was sitting in the snow, about the specific quality of the evenings by the fire that she had been refusing to name. "I think," she said carefully, "that you might find if you paid attention that it is not entirely one-sided." He looked at her for a long moment, and then the corner of his mouth moved in that particular way, and he said, "I had some hope in that direction." "Do not be smug about it," she said. "I'm not," he said. "I'm relieved." She laughed, and he smiled, and the fire went on burning between them, and it was the simplest and most significant thing that had happened in the cabin since her father had built it. Her ankle kept her inside for 10 days, which Marshall managed by doing twice the external work and not complaining about it, and by spending the evenings closer to her chair than he had previously, which was noticed and appreciated. They talked more freely now, with the ease of two people who have passed through a particular gate and found the territory on the other side more spacious. She told him things she had not told anyone in a long time, about her mother who had died when she was 12, about the years of being her father's only companion and his only helper, about what it had been like to be a girl on a cattle operation, and to know the work as well as any hired hand and to be regarded by the world as decorative rather than useful. "It made me stubborn," she said. "It made you competent," he said. "The stubbornness was the bonus." "You already made that joke," she said. "It bears repeating," he said. On the 10th day she put her boot back on and walked carefully out to the pasture with him to check on the cattle, and it hurt, but it was bearable, and he walked beside her at a pace that accommodated hers without making a ceremony of it, and the sky above the snow-covered land was absolutely clear, a winter blue so deep it almost had color in it, and their breath made small clouds that mingled and dispersed in the cold air. He took her hand as they walked, without announcement or particular drama, simply reaching sideways and closing his fingers around hers, and she did not pull away. They walked the property together in the cold and the light, and she felt something settle in her that had been unsettled since February, some long-held tightness in the chest that released with the particular relief of a thing returning to its proper place. The spring came with a rush of green that transformed the pasture from February brown to something vivid and full of promise inside a week, and the work multiplied accordingly. The kitchen garden was cleared and turned and planted. The lean-to addition, now properly rebuilt, became a working space for tools and tack. Marshall bought 12 more cattle in April from Dempsey, and 3 more from a rancher passing through who needed cash, and they had a respectable herd by May. Not large, but quality animals on good grass with good water. Ellen's garden produced vegetables through the spring and into summer, and she put up preserves with the same thoroughness she brought to everything, and the cabin had the smell of warm canning jars and wood smoke, and the particular clean scent of a place that is being properly kept. She received a letter from Clara Collier, insent. Joseph in April, responding to one that Marshall had sent in January describing the property and the arrangement, and presumably, something more than the arrangement. Clara's letter was warm and direct, and showed clearly where Marshall had inherited his particular brand of useful honesty. She expressed her hope to visit before the year was out, and she said that any woman who had bought back her father's land with $230 was someone she was very much looking forward to meeting. Ellen read the letter twice and wrote back the same afternoon. The trouble with Gerald Pratt came to a head in June. He had been making quiet trouble since winter, small things. The east fence was cut once and 3 of their heifers wandered out and had to be recovered from Pratt's land with considerable inconvenience. Ellen was fairly certain Pratt's men had done the cutting, though she could not prove it. Then Pratt had sent a man to Caldwell with a story about there being a question regarding the deed to the Crawford property. A story that had no legal basis but required Whitmore to write 3 letters on their behalf to establish the matter conclusively, which cost time and money. Then in June, Pratt himself came back, this time with 2 of his men, and the offer he made was less polite than the first one. Ellen and Marshall were both in the yard when he arrived, which was, she thought afterward, fortunate. Pratt looked at the repaired fencing and the rebuilt lean-to and the healthy cattle in the pasture with the particular expression of a man who resents evidence of other people's competence. "I'll give you $500 for the whole of it," he said. "That's more than fair." "The property is not for sale," Ellen said. Pratt's eyes moved to Marshall. "Collier, talk some sense." "Miss Crawford speaks for the property as well as I do," Marshall said. "You've had our answer, Mr. Pratt, repeatedly." Pratt leaned forward in his saddle. "That spring is on the county water map. There may be a public access question." "There is no public access question," Ellen said. "The spring is on deeded private land. Whitmore has confirmed it in writing. Do you want a copy? I have one inside." Pratt's jaw tightened. His 2 men sat their horses and looked at the middle distance with the carefully blank expressions of men who were hired to be present rather than to think. "This isn't finished," Pratt said. "I believe it is," Marshall said, with the specific tone of a man who is done discussing a thing. "You're welcome to pursue whatever legal avenue you believe is open to you, Mr. Pratt, but you're trespassing right now, and I'd like you to leave." Pratt looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Ellen. Then he turned his horse and rode away with his men, and the sound of the hooves diminished across the pasture and disappeared. Ellen let out a slow breath. "I'm going to write to Whitmore tomorrow about the county water map question. I want that closed completely." "That's exactly right," Marshall said. He looked at her with that expression that had never entirely stopped being new to her. "You know, you are absolutely remarkable when you deal with people who underestimate you." "Is it remarkable?" she said. "It feels like just standing there." "That's what makes it remarkable," he said. They wrote to Whitmore the next morning, and Whitmore confirmed within the week that there was no legal basis for any public access claim on the spring, and that Pratt's property did not adjoin theirs in any way that created an easement, and he suggested that Pratt's behavior constituted harassment and that they had grounds to seek a formal complaint if it continued. Pratt did not come back. It was in July, on an evening when the heat had been building all day and had finally broken into a spectacular thunderstorm that lit the whole sky over the prairie and filled the cabin with the smell of rain on dry earth, that Marshall asked her to marry him. He did not make a great production of it. They were sitting on the narrow porch watching the lightning move across the sky to the south, and the rain was falling straight and hard beyond the porch roof, and she had her coffee and he had his, and he turned to look at her and said, "Ellen, will you marry me?" She looked at him. The lightning moved across the southern sky, and the thunder followed it, rolling and deep, and the rain came down steadily, and she thought about the auction yard in October with all those men laughing, and the long cold winter and the spring that followed it, and the way he said her name, and the way he had lifted her out of the snow without making her feel fragile, and the way he listened, and the way he had paid for her father's debt without being asked and without expecting thanks. And she thought about the fact that she had been building something here that was larger than the land and larger than the cattle operation, and she had known it for months and had simply been waiting, in her own way, to be certain. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes." He smiled, and the lightning lit his face, and he reached over and took her hand the same way he had taken it in the snow in January, without ceremony and without hesitation, and they sat together on the porch in the rain and watched the storm move east across the prairie. They were married in September in the Caldwell Methodist Church that Ellen had attended with her father since she was a child. The ceremony was performed by a reverend named Alcott who had a genuine warmth to him and conducted the service without unnecessary length. Mrs. Hanratty came, and old Mr. Farrow, the schoolteacher, sent a letter of congratulation from Dodge City. Whitmore came and shook both their hands with the air of a man who feels personally responsible for positive outcomes he has had relatively little to do with. A few of the neighboring ranchers came, people Ellen had known since childhood, and they all seemed genuinely glad for her in a way that suggested the town of Caldwell had perhaps been more worried about Ellen Crawford than it had let on. Clara Collier came from St. Joseph. She was exactly as her letter had suggested, a small, forthright woman with quick dark eyes and the same quality of attention in her listening that her son possessed. She arrived 2 days before the wedding and immediately became useful in the kitchen, and she and Ellen spent 2 evenings in conversation that went on so long they had to remind each other to sleep. On the second evening, when Marshall had gone to bed and they were still at the table with the lamp burning low, Clara took Ellen's hand briefly and said, "My son has written to me about you since January. I want you to know that he has never written to me like that about anyone in his life." Ellen was quiet for a moment. "He is a good man," she said. "He is," Clara said, "and he deserves a good woman. I am very glad it is you." Ellen squeezed her hand once and then let go, because sentiment required a limit when you were Ellen Crawford, but the feeling behind it went deep. The wedding was on a clear September afternoon, with the light the same gold and thin blue of the October day she had ridden to the auction a year before, and Ellen wore a dress she had made herself from a cream-colored wool that she had ordered from the dry goods store in Caldwell, and Marshall wore a dark suit that Mrs. Hanratty had pressed for him that morning, and they stood in front of Reverend Alcott and the gathered faces and said what they meant. Afterward, there was a supper at the cabin that Clara and Missy Hanratty had organized between them with considerable efficiency, and it was an evening of the kind that Ellen thought she might remember all her life, not because it was dramatic but because it was full, every person in the room genuinely present, and the lamps lit warm, and the smell of the food and the sound of talking and laughter, and Marshall beside her with his hand at the small of her back. Clara stayed through October before returning to St. Joseph, and her departure left a gap that surprised Ellen a little, being accustomed as she was to her own company. But Marshall was there, and the work was there, and the land was there, and the autumn came around again to the anniversary of the auction, and Ellen stood in the pasture on that morning and looked at the cabin on its rise and felt something that was simply uncomplicated peace. The first years of marriage were full of work and full of the texture of two people learning to live together with all the adjustments and negotiations that required, and they were good. There were arguments, because they were both people with strong opinions, and neither of them was inclined to withdraw from a position without reason. There was the argument in November of their first year about whether to sell 4 of the cattle at what Marshall thought was the right market moment and Ellen thought was premature, and he turned out to be right, which she acknowledged, and she turned out to be right the following spring about the breeding question, which he acknowledged, and the acknowledgments were given without resentment, and that was itself a kind of love, she thought. The cattle operation grew steadily. By the spring of 1885 they had 40 head, and Marshall hired a hand named Josiah Rivers, a young man of 20 from south of Wichita who was a hard worker, and who had a quiet dignity about him that Ellen appreciated, and who was treated with the same respect as anyone else on the property, which was not, she knew, something that could be said of every cattle operation in Kansas. Josiah had been hired by 2 previous operations and let go from both of them for reasons that he stated plainly when Marshall asked about his history, reasons that had nothing to do with his work and everything to do with the fact that he was black in a part of the country where this was still, in 1885, a frequent basis for injustice. Marshall had looked at him across the hiring conversation and said simply, "You're judged on your work here." nothing else. And Josiah had nodded once with the expression of someone who had heard similar things before and was reserving judgment on whether they were true. And by the end of the first month he had concluded that on this property they were in fact true, and he stayed. In the spring of 1885, Ellen discovered she was with child. She told Marshall on a morning in March when the first green was beginning to push through the brown of the pasture, and she said it directly, the way she said most things, and he was quiet for a full 10 seconds, which was extraordinary for a man who was not given to speechlessness, and then he closed the distance between them and held her in a way that communicated everything he could not immediately find words for. "Are you well?" he said against her hair. "I am perfectly well," she said. "I am going to keep working." "Of course you are," he said. "I'm telling you in advance in case you were planning to treat me like I was made of glass. I have seen you crawl across a snow-covered pasture on a sprained ankle rather than ask for help," he said. "It would not have occurred to me to treat you like glass." She laughed into his shoulder. He held her tighter. Their son was born in November of 1885, on a cold, clear morning when the first frost of the season had laid itself over the pasture and the light was pale and beautiful. He came into the world with Marshall's dark hair and Ellen's particular expression of determined assessment, looking around the room as though already taking inventory, and Ellen held him and felt something absolutely wordless move through her entire chest. They named him Samuel for her father. Clara came from St. Joseph and stayed through the first month, and Josiah brought firewood every morning without being asked and left it at the door, and Mrs. Hanratty drove out from Caldwell with preserves and a quilt she had made herself. Marshall held his son on the first evening with a care that was different from all the other kinds of care she had seen him apply to things, and he looked at Samuel with an expression she had never seen on him before, something so unguarded and full that it took her breath slightly. "He looks like your father," Marshall said, "in the photograph you have." "I thought so too," she said. He looked at her over the baby's head with that expression, and she looked back, and no other words were particularly necessary. Samuel was a child of his parents in the best respects, curious and determined and entirely unconcerned with what was expected of him, and he grew up on the Crawford Collier operation, understanding from the beginning that work was something both men and women did with equal seriousness, because that was simply the truth of his house. By the time he was 3, he was following his father around the pasture, and by 4, he was asking questions at a rate that suggested he intended to understand everything about everything at the earliest possible opportunity. In 1887, Ellen and Marshall added 12 acres to the property, purchasing a strip of land to the north that gave them better access to the upper pasture and additional water rights along Bluff Creek. Whitmore drew up the deed and shook both their hands and said that in 20 years of practicing law in Caldwell, he had watched the Crawford land go from a debt-laden 43 acres to what was shaping into one of the better-run small cattle operations in the county, and he considered himself peripherally responsible for this, and he was very pleased. By the summer of 1888, the herd was 63 head, and Josiah had become something closer to a foreman than a hand, a fact that was reflected in his wages and in the way the operation functioned. He had sent for his wife, a woman named Louise, in the spring of 1887, and she had come out from Wichita and settled into the small house that Marshall had built for Josiah on the north section of the property. And Louise Rivers turned out to be a person of such capable warmth that she and Ellen became friends with a naturalness that felt like inevitability. It was Louise who was with Ellen when her second child came in October of 1888, while Marshall was out with Josiah moving cattle from the east pasture, and Louise who handled the whole business with a practicality and steadiness that Ellen afterward told Marshall should have earned her considerably more credit than she was accustomed to receiving. The baby was a girl, with Ellen's dark hair and Marshall's tendency to look directly at things without flinching, and they named her Clara for his mother. Clara Collier Sr. came from St. Joseph again and held her namesake and cried briefly, which was the only time Ellen had seen the woman cry, and she recovered herself immediately and said the baby had excellent color and a very strong grip, and that she was exactly as she ought to be. The years moved. Samuel grew into a boy who had his mother's competence and his father's patience, and a particular gift for mathematics that neither of them could fully account for. Little Clara grew into a person with opinions on everything and the voice to express them, and she followed Ellen everywhere on the property the way Samuel followed Marshall. And she was at 4 years old already an authority on the kitchen garden and the canning process, and had developed strong views on which of the cattle she liked best as individuals, and she named them all, which Marshall said was impractical, and which he was entirely ignored on. Marshall Collier had become, by 1890, a man entirely rooted in this piece of the Kansas plain. The years of trail driving had left him, and what replaced them was something quieter and more sustaining, the specific satisfaction of a place and a life that were genuinely his. He rode the property every morning before breakfast, a habit from the early days that he had never broken, and sometimes Ellen rode with him, and sometimes she stayed and had the coffee ready when he came in, and both were good. He wrote to his mother every month without fail. He continued to argue, at the Caldwell Cattlemen's Association meetings, for fair treatment of the Cheyenne and Arapaho people whose dispossession he and Ellen had discussed on that winter evening years ago, and he was not the most popular voice in the room when he did so. But he was consistent, and over years some of the other men had come around at least partially to his position, which was the usual pace of progress in such things. He had never once, in all the years since October 1883, regretted raising his hand at the auction. On a September morning in 1891, Ellen was in the kitchen garden doing the last harvest of the season when Samuel, who was 5½ and growing at a rate that seemed to require new boots every 2 months, came running across the yard with his hair flying and his face full of news. "Mama, there is a wagon on the road and Papa says it is Grandmother Clara," he announced. Ellen straightened and looked toward the road, and sure enough there was a wagon coming along at a comfortable pace, and she could see even at a distance the upright, compact figure of Clara Collier Sr. on the seat. Clara was 63 now, and had developed a slight stiffness in her right hip that she mentioned only when directly asked and otherwise ignored, and she still ran the dry goods store in St. Joseph, though she had a young man working for her now who did the heavier lifting. She had come for a month every year since the wedding, and she had watched Samuel and young Clara grow, and she had been part of the texture of their life in a way that mattered. She climbed down from the wagon with Marshall's help and embraced Ellen with the firm, brief warmth that was her style, and she held little Clara, who was nearly 3 and had a great deal to say about the chickens, and she ruffled Samuel's hair and said he had grown another inch, and then she looked at Ellen with the quick assessment that had always made Ellen feel both seen and comfortable. "You look well," Clara said. "I am well," Ellen said. "More than well," Clara said, and she said it with a particular emphasis, and Ellen smiled. "You always see things quickly," Ellen said. Clara raised an eyebrow. "March or April," she said. "March," Ellen said. Clara took both her hands and pressed them briefly. "Good," she said. "Very good." That evening when the children were in bed and Clara was settled in the room that was permanently hers when she visited, Ellen and Marshall sat on the porch in the September dark, and the sky was full of stars the way it was in September on the prairie, an absolute quantity of them, more than could be individually reckoned with, and the air was cool and held the smell of the coming autumn. Marshall's arm was around her shoulders, and she was leaning against him in the comfortable, unself-conscious way of people who have been close for a long time and know each other's weight and warmth as well as their own. "Your mother knew immediately," she said. He laughed quietly. "She always does. I think she may be psychic. I think she is simply very observant," he said. "It's a family trait." Ellen tipped her head back and looked at the stars. "Samuel will be pleased," she said. "He has been asking for another sibling for 6 months. "He'll be a good older brother to two," Marshall said. "He already is," she said. "He is," Marshall agreed. "He's a good person, you've done that." "We've done that," she said. He turned his head and pressed his mouth to her hair. "We have," he said. The night went on around them, and the stars were innumerable, and the land they had built together spread out in the dark beyond the porch. The pastures and the creek and the spring and the east fence line that they had repaired together in the first October, and the cabin that her father had built in 1864, that was now a house full of children and books, and the smell of coffee, and the sound of honest work. And Ellen Crawford Collier sat in the particular contentment of a woman who has fought for something true and won it, not by luck but by courage and by finding, in the most unexpected of circumstances, someone who was worth finding. She thought, as she sometimes did, about the auction yard, about the October light and the crowd of men, about Gerald Pratt's smile and Bixby's uncertain look, about the laughter, the particular sound of it, the specific quality of a thing that is meant to diminish. And she thought about the man at the edge of the crowd who had not laughed, who had watched her raised hand with something that was recognition and respect, and who had then done the most straightforward thing and bid, and who had carried the whole long chain of consequence from that moment to this porch, to this night, to these children asleep inside, to this life. She reached up and took his hand where it rested on her shoulder. "Marshall," she said. "Yes. I am glad you came to that auction," she said. He was quiet for a moment. She felt him smile against her hair. "Ellen," he said, "going to that auction was the most important thing I have ever accidentally done." She laughed, and the sound of it went out into the Kansas night and was carried off gently by the autumn air. And the stars went on in their innumerable spreading above the land that was theirs, the land her father had built and she had fought for, and they had made together into something larger and more generous than either of them could have built alone. The third baby came in March of 1892, as predicted, on a day when the winter was finally beginning to release its grip, and the first pale shoots were pushing through the kitchen garden soil. He was a boy, red-faced and loud, and fully committed to his own existence from the first moment, and they named him James, which was Marshall's father's name, a man he had lost young and remembered with a particular kind of quiet grief that he rarely spoke about but that Ellen understood. James was, from the beginning, the loudest person in the house. Samuel received him with the grave, pleased responsibility of a 6.5-year-old who has been trusted with something important. Little Clara received him with the proprietorial interest of a nearly 4-year-old who has decided she is already in charge of everything and is merely expanding her territory. Clara Sr. held James on the evening of his first day and said he had his grandfather Collier's chin, and Marshall looked at his son and said he hoped the resemblance stopped there because his father had also had his grandfather's stubbornness. And Ellen said that stubbornness was apparently a trait that circulated through families she was associated with. And Clara Collier laughed and said that it was the most useful trait in any family's inventory. Josiah Rivers stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and said congratulations with the genuine warmth of a man who has become, over years, something more than an employee. And Louise brought a pot of stew that would have fed 8 people, and left it with the practical love of someone who knows that the best thing to give a family with a newborn is not to make them think about food. The spring of 1892 was one of the best they had. The cattle sold well at market, the grass was exceptional after a wet winter, and the expanded north pasture proved its worth. Marshall began to talk cautiously about adding a proper barn structure to replace the combination of the lean-to and the existing small outbuilding that had served since the beginning, and he and Josiah spent a month drawing plans and figuring costs. And by July the barn was rising, the frame going up in 3 days with the help of 4 neighboring ranchers who came because Marshall had helped 2 of them with their own projects in previous years, and that was how things worked. Ellen stood in the yard on the day the frame went up and watched the skeleton of the building take shape against the summer sky, and she thought about the way things accumulated, the decision to bid at an auction, the decision to sign a partnership agreement, the decision to build and stay and keep building. Each thing had led to the next with a logic that seemed obvious in retrospect, and had felt like improvisation in the moment, which was perhaps the only honest description of how a life was actually made. Samuel came and stood beside her, holding James on his hip with the practiced ease of a big brother who has been carrying his younger sibling since James could be reliably held, and he said, "Is the barn going to be bigger than the house?" "Considerably," Ellen said. Samuel considered this. "That seems wrong," he said. "The cattle are more numerous than the family," she said. "We could get more children," he suggested. She looked at him with the particular look that mothers reserve for children who have said something simultaneously amusing and unnecessary. "We have 3, she said. "Clara says she wants a sister," Samuel reported. "Clara also wants to name all the cattle and make up songs for them," Ellen said. "We cannot accommodate every ambition." Samuel grinned, a wide, open grin that was entirely his father's, and James grabbed at his brother's ear with the enthusiastic imprecision of a 6-month-old. And Ellen took James from Samuel and held him against her hip and watched the barn go up in the summer light. And the whole of her ordinary, extraordinary life was present in the scene, and she was grateful for every piece of it. The years continued, and the land continued, and the family that had begun with a raised hand at an auction in 1883 grew and deepened, and filled out the cabin and the extended house that Marshall added a room to in 1893 to accommodate the expanding reality of 3 children and the visitors who came regularly now. Clara Collier Sr. came every September without fail and wrote letters every month. The Wichita bank that had forced the original sale closed in 1894, a victim of the economic panic that was rolling through the country. And Ellen felt something about this that she could not entirely call satisfaction, but that was not entirely not satisfaction either. Josiah and Louise Rivers had 2 children of their own by 1894, a boy named Thomas and a girl named Ada. And Thomas and Samuel were inseparable in the way that boys become when they grow up working the same land. And Ada followed little Clara around with the devoted certainty of someone who has identified the most interesting person in her world and intends to stay close to her. Marshall Collier, in the late summer of 1894, was asked by the Caldwell Cattlemen's Association to serve as their representative at a territorial meeting in Wichita regarding new grazing legislation. And he went. And he came back 2 days later with a report on the meeting and the observation that the territorial legislature was as slow and as inconsistent as ever, but that there were some decent men in it who were at least asking the right questions. He also came back with a small carved wooden horse that he had found at a market in Wichita, which he gave to young Clara, who named it immediately and declared it her best horse because it never argued with her. Ellen watched him give the horse to Clara from across the room, watched the way he crouched down to be at Clara's level, and listened to her describe her naming process with the full seriousness he brought to every conversation he considered worth having, and she thought that this was, in fact, the thing about him that had always been the truest thing. Not the competence, not the steadiness, not the way he worked or the way he argued or the way he carried her across a snow-covered pasture. The truest thing about Marshall Collier was the way he took people seriously, all of them, all the time. She had known it from the auction yard, from those 3 seconds in which she had registered a face in the crowd that was not laughing, a pair of dark eyes that were watching her raised hand with something other than contempt. She had not been able to name it then, standing in the October dust with $230 in her coat. She could name it now. He saw people. He saw her from the first moment, and he had kept on seeing her, through all the seasons and the work and the arguments and the children and the years, with a clarity and a consistency that was the best kind of love she could imagine, because it was love that did not require her to be other than she was. on the evening of their 11th anniversary in September of 1894, with the children in bed and the house quiet and the September stars beginning their own old performance above the Kansas plain. Ellen and Marshall sat on the porch that had been expanded and repaired 3 times since the first version, and they had their coffee, and the night was warm still in the way September nights sometimes were, and the crickets were saying their last things before the cold came. 11 years, Marshall said. Is that remarkable to you? She said. Yes, he said, in the best way. She looked at the dark pasture, the shape of the barn against the stars, the light from the river's house to the north, a small warm square in the dark. I used to think I would be alone for a long time, she said. Not unhappily necessarily, but alone. It seemed like the shape of things. What changed it? He said. She looked at him. You didn't laugh, she said. He looked back at her and she saw him understand it fully, the weight of those 2 words, the whole compressed history of them. No, he said. I didn't. It was the first thing, she said. Everything was the first thing, but that was the first. He reached over, the same motion he had made in the January snow, easy and without ceremony, and took her hand. Ellen, he said. Yes. I would do it again, he said. Every morning of every day for the next 11 years and whatever comes after. She turned her hand in his and held it properly, the way she held things she intended to keep. So would I, she said. The September night went on around them, and the land that had been her father's, and then the banks, and then a stranger's, and then theirs stretched out in the dark, full of its own quiet life. Somewhere in the east pasture, one of the cattle moved and the grass absorbed the sound. Somewhere along Bluff Creek, the water continued its unhurried passage toward wherever it was going. Inside the house, 3 children slept in their rooms, Samuel with a book still open on his chest the way his mother always did, Clara with her carved wooden horse on the pillow beside her, and James with the absolute committed abandon of a 2-year-old for whom sleeping was just another activity to be done completely. And on the porch of the house that had begun as her father's cabin on a rise above the eastern fork of Bluff Creek, Ellen Crawford Collier and Marshall Collier sat together in the warm September dark, and held on to each other's hands, and let the years rest around them, not as a weight, but as the natural accumulation of everything they had built. Every morning of work, and every evening of talk, and every argument, and every repair, and every calf born in the cold, and every jar of preserves, and every letter from St. Joseph, and every moment they had chosen this, the land and the life, and each other. The stars spread themselves in their enormous quantity overhead, and the night went on, and the house stood on its rise, solid and warm and full of the people who belonged to it. And below on the pasture the grass moved once in a small breath of wind, and everything was exactly as it ought to be.